While the Victorian government continues to spend taxpayer money trying to stop a class action over what many deem as the harsh and unnecessary lockdowns that led to the collapse of many businesses, Supreme Court Justice John Dixon had the government reeling when he denied the government the opportunity to have the proceedings stayed again. Now, it's a case that will continue to proceed even while the government fights a separate criminal proceedings brought by WorkSafe Victoria against the Department of Health over its hotel quarantine program. Well, joining us once again is our political editor, Anchor Sahin. Welcome, Anchor.
Hi, Michael.
Now, you've written another insightful LinkedIn piece. They're all brilliant reading, and I urge everyone to get on them. It seems that there's a catch to the government winning. And what's that catch?
The point I made, Michael, was that if the government wins, obviously the taxpayer will have to foot the bill because there will be compensation due to those businesses that have been affected by the mistakes made. So the essence of the case, as you'll also be aware, is that these businesses are saying that because the government did not fulfill its obligations to businesses, Victorian businesses, with regard to health and safety, when they allowed the hotel quarantine to fall apart and leading to the lockdowns. Now, people will have their different views on that because it ultimately comes down to, does that even justify the lockdowns? And that's a separate story. And that's not really what the case is about. The case is about whether the government was deficient in upholding its responsibilities to Victorians and to those businesses in particular. So my point was, if the government loses, obviously that will lead to compensation being considered for those businesses, and to fund those that compensation, we might be looking at maybe increased rates or some new taxes, or possibly funding being moved around from the budget to ensure that payment or compensation can be made. On the other hand, if the government loses, well, that's terrible for those businesses that have had to suffer through the lockdowns, being denied the opportunity to trade freely, and in some cases leading to significant losses, or possibly the loss of the entire business itself.
Am I right in assuming that the crux of the case is basically not whether the lockdowns were justified, but had the government managed the hotel quarantine properly, that the lockdowns wouldn't have been necessary or as severe?
That is correct. So it's not the lockdowns themselves that are the subject of the proceedings, of these particular proceedings. It was that they were needed at all, and that's what's being challenged.
How much of this depends on that WorkSafe investigation, where if they say, right, they failed in their obligations to provide adequate training to make sure that the system would be efficient and safe, how much does it depend on that? If they find that there was no fault, they did everything, does this case then look shaky?
I think the two are quite separate. This is about the government's responsibility to the businesses and to Victorians more broadly. And I think, this case will still be heard on its own merits, regardless of what happens with the other one.
Now, again, we have the same principle that you've just mentioned. If the government wins, we lose, because we fund their case. If the government loses, we lose. So it's a lose-lose situation. But it's the same with the workplace safety case as well, where we have the ridiculous prospect of a body that we fund with our tax dollars investigating the government that says, I think they're up to $96 million in possible fines. And they say to the government, you did wrong, write us a check for $96 million. They give it to WorkSafe, and WorkSafe gives it back to the government. Am I reading it wrong, Anchor?
I'm really not sure how that money goes from, one pocket to another. But yes, ultimately, it looks like a bit of a musical chairs, where the people of Victoria are the ultimate losers.
And the big difference between a commercial entity, a company here, is there's no one here that is going to face charges, because we saw with the Coat inquiry, no one remembers who signed the contract. No one remembers who was in charge. So it's basically, it's in the ether. Who actually wears responsibility here?
It becomes so difficult to, even when you prove your case, even when you've got a case that's pretty tight in terms of the argument that you're running, you still have to ultimately pin it on an individual, or the body that they're part of. And often what seems to happen, as we've seen with other inquiries before and similar cases, is the government just plays a game of shifting the blame. So it's a constant train of fingers being pointed from one to the other to the other to the other, to such an extent that by the end of it, you don't know who was the original finger pointer and who ended up getting the last finger pointed at them.
Yeah, we've seen everybody who within reach of this been moved well out of reach. Chris Eccles couldn't remember who signed the contract, but he stepped down to avoid any blowback on the government. We saw Jenny Makakos, another one, under the bus. So we've cleared the decks so that even if the case is approved by WorkSafe and this damages case goes ahead, there's actually nobody left, because, as Daniel Andrews could not recall, where does it go after that?
Well, look, apart from the Premier, everyone's had their go, and they've since moved on. And even if there's an investigation or a case that ultimately says person X was responsible, in practice, nothing will happen. It comes down to the Victorian people, who not only had to suffer the consequences of both the government's failure to run hotel quarantine properly and to fund it correctly and to resource it correctly. So their failure to do that, which forms the basis of this case, but also ultimately what it led to, the lockdowns, the endless lockdowns, one after the other. And of course, the policy settings that informed those lockdowns, which started with 14 days to flatten the curve and ended up going for full elimination.
And we also saw during this time, while businesses were being closed as a result of the failings of this issue that's before the court, we saw politicians get a pay rise. We saw the Pratts having parties that weren't prosecuted. We also saw a lady arrested and handcuffed, a pregnant lady in her own home, for a Facebook post. And the disparity between one and the other. We saw rubber bullets fired at protesters. We saw, previous to that, a Black Lives Matter protest that was heralded as a worthy protest. Do you think this division that has been created will ever be gotten over?
It's anyone's guess, Michael. I think it'll take a very long time before people feel that they can put their trust in the government as they were able to before the pandemic. Not that the government always used that trust correctly and appropriately, but there's no doubt that what's happened during the pandemic and the response and some of those examples that you gave, and of course the perception of double standards between what they felt was good enough for them and what they felt was good enough for the common people, in terms of, I think pay rises is a good example, both in federal public service and state public service. People continued to be guaranteed their roles. They were able to keep their roles. They were able to work 100% in some cases, or in many cases, 100% remotely without any pay cuts, and also getting pay rises regularly, as if things were just continuing on as normal out in the real world, where people working for private enterprise had to accept pay cuts, reduction in their hours, and in many instances they lost their jobs completely because they were working in an industry that just could not operate in that lockdown environment. The remote arrangement didn't work for every industry, and hospitality being a very obvious example. So yeah, I think those divisions that have been created, it's going to be a long time before they heal completely.
Yeah. All right, we've got to leave it there, Anchor. So thanks again for your time, everyone. Check out Anchor's writing on LinkedIn. They're always insightful and thought-provoking, and just a great read. So Anchor, thanks so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Michael.